The annals of history hold a question so profound, so unsettling, that it dares not appear in official pronouncements or sacred texts, yet it persists like an unquenchable ember. If Christ indeed left heirs, why would the Vatican engage in such a fierce and relentless campaign to obliterate their very memory? This query, charged with a quiet menace, has rippled through the centuries. It surfaces in the faded parchment of forgotten manuscripts, in the enigmatic symbols carved into ancient stones, and in the hushed narratives passed down through generations. For millennia, the established Church has steadfastly proclaimed Christ as the eternal Son of God, a singular, divine entity, utterly without earthly progeny or a mortal lineage. This unwavering declaration forms the very bedrock of its immense authority, the foundational truth upon which towering cathedrals have been erected, papal decrees issued, and ecclesiastical councils convened. Should it ever be revealed that Christ had children, that his bloodline extended into the temporal world, then the exclusive claim to power would be irrevocably wrested from Rome. Instead, that sacred authority would pulse through living veins, a tangible legacy of flesh and blood that no decree, no matter how absolute, could ever truly erase. But pause for a moment and consider the monumental implications. A Christ with direct descendants would usher in a new era of dynasties, families laying claim to divine lineage. These would be individuals who could assert spiritual and political dominion not through the blessing of a pope, but by undeniable birthright. The Church, in such a scenario, would no longer stand as the sole guardian of divine authority. It would face formidable rivals, perhaps even superiors, walking among humanity. Thus, we are drawn back to that haunting, persistent question. If such a sacred bloodline truly existed, would not the Church exhaust every conceivable resource to conceal it, to silence its proponents, and to bury it beneath an impenetrable strata of doctrine and accumulated dust? The very trajectory of history, upon closer inspection, offers compelling reasons to ponder this possibility. From the earliest ecclesiastical councils, where alternative gospels were summarily dismissed and condemned, to the brutal inquisitions that ruthlessly punished even the faintest whisper of heresy, the Vatican has waged war not merely against sin, but against narratives. Narratives that imperiled its absolute monopoly on spiritual truth. These were stories of a Christ who was not solely spirit, but also a father, whose profound teachings might have continued not only through spoken words, but also through the lives of his children. And here, a profound paradox emerges. The more vehemently something is denied, the more instinctively one begins to perceive its lingering shadow. Why construct such formidable walls of silence if there is truly nothing of substance concealed behind them? Why invest such immense effort in erasing a truth if there is genuinely nothing there to be forgotten? Perhaps, then, the Church's most consequential conflict was not fought on open battlefields with gleaming swords and fluttering banners, but rather in the hushed confines of silence itself, in archives meticulously cleansed by fire, in ancient manuscripts smothered under layers of red ink, in collective memories deliberately suppressed and reshaped. It was a war waged not against opposing armies, but against the very concept of an inheritance. It is precisely at this elusive juncture, where the remembered blurs with the forgotten, that this extraordinary journey commences. A narrative woven from threads of immense power, profound fear, and impenetrable secrecy. a chronicle of a bloodline that may or may not still move silently among us, hidden in plain sight. So let us proceed with caution, gently, as the shadows of night begin to gather. For within the profound silence between the pages of recorded history, that forbidden question continues to whisper. The widely accepted narrative of Christ concludes dramatically upon the desolate hill of Calvary. A stark cross silhouetted against the sky, a crown of thorns pressed deep into suffering flesh, a moment of ultimate sacrifice that has resonated through countless centuries of unwavering faith. Yet, beneath the solemn, almost sacred beauty of this iconic image, a chorus of unspoken questions has always lingered, refusing to be silenced. Was that truly the definitive end? Did the entirety of the story conclude with the brutal impact of nails and the profound stillness of death? Or was there something more, a crucial chapter left tantalizingly unspoken, deliberately excised from the official account? The canonical Gospels, while offering vivid and explicit details regarding his death, his burial, and his miraculous resurrection, become notably less clear about the years that immediately followed. They offer only fleeting glimpses into the subsequent lives of those who knew him most intimately: Mary Magdalene, his devoted disciples, and the families who journeyed alongside him in Galilee. These pivotal figures, whose proximity to Christ was unparalleled, seemed to fade quietly into the periphery of Scripture, their ultimate fates shrouded in uncertainty, their personal narratives left frustratingly incomplete. But a persistent undercurrent of whispers endures. Whispers suggesting that after the harrowing events of the cross, not all was truly lost. That a fragile yet remarkably enduring thread of his life continued to weave its way beyond the tomb. Some of these tantalizing whispers surface in apocryphal texts, gospels conspicuously not sanctioned by the early church. In the enigmatic Gospel of Philip, for instance, Mary Magdalene is not merely called a follower, but explicitly referred to as his companion, a term laden with connotations far deeper and more intimate than mere friendship. In other suppressed writings, her portrayal transcends that of a mere disciple, elevating her to a position of profound closeness, perhaps even bound to him in ways too profoundly human, too emotionally resonant, to ever be comfortably accommodated within official doctrine. Could it be that a love deliberately unacknowledged shaped the hidden, more earthly side of the nascent Christian story? Could it be that from this profound union a child was born, an heir whose very existence, if ever revealed, would have irrevocably altered the entire course of faith for all time? The nascent early church, in its fervent quest for consolidation and doctrinal purity, simply could not tolerate such audacious questions. At councils convened in dimly lit, shadowed halls, texts that dared to hint at too much humanity, too much earthly connection, were systematically set aside, vehemently branded as heretical, and left to decay in forgotten desert caves or consigned to oblivion in cleansing flames. Orthodoxy was rigorously enforced, and with it, an impenetrable wall of silence descended. Yet silence, it must be remembered, is not synonymous with absence. Even as centuries steadily marched onward, faint echoes of these forbidden narratives stubbornly remained. Stories whispered furtively in the remote cloisters of monasteries, ancient traditions meticulously preserved within the secretive rites of hidden societies, and compelling legends that subtly infiltrated the dynastic histories of European royalty. Always the same haunting refrain resonated. Perhaps the cross was not the absolute end. Perhaps, instead, it marked the clandestine beginning of a lineage too profoundly dangerous to openly acknowledge or even name. If this extraordinary claim holds true, then the crucifixion was not merely a tragic culmination, but rather a carefully woven veil. Behind this veil, meticulously hidden from the scrutiny of the world, a sacred bloodline began its quiet, clandestine journey. The very flesh of Christ, the seed of prophecy, a living, breathing legacy. And if such a legacy genuinely existed, then the Vatican's prolonged and relentless war against memory, against truth, against history itself, begins to assume a chilling and utterly comprehensible logic. The brutal act of the cross may have effectively silenced the man, but the resonant echoes of his life, his teachings, and his potential lineage could not be so easily expunged or erased. In the earliest centuries following the crucifixion, Christianity was not yet the imposing, monolithic institution of cathedrals and powerful hierarchies, but rather a fragile whisper. It spread organically and quietly, from house to house, through heartfelt songs sung in hidden rooms, and through cryptic symbols meticulously etched onto stone by trembling, clandestine hands. Rome, at that nascent stage, had not yet embraced this burgeoning faith. Instead, emperors ruthlessly hunted its adherents, soldiers mercilessly scattered its fragile communities, and believers, with extraordinary courage, carried its delicate flame like a precious, vulnerable ember from one town to the next. Yet, even amidst these scattered sparks of faith, persistent rumors began to circulate. Rumors of something even more perilous, more revolutionary than the faith itself, a tangible legacy of blood. In the sacred lands of the Holy Land, families passed down stories that were conspicuously absent from the Gospels, approved by powerful bishops. Tales of Mary Magdalene embarking on secret journeys, stories of children born in the protective shadow of Rome's ever-watchful gaze. These were narratives that spoke not just of spirit, but of flesh, of a physical continuation of what had so profoundly begun in Galilee. Some of these compelling tales were painstakingly preserved in what scholars now refer to as apocryphal writings: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Philip, among others. All were vehemently rejected by the councils that ultimately shaped the New Testament canon. These texts offered tantalizing fragments, enigmatic puzzles, and half-spoken hints of a Christianity that was far less concerned with imperial power and far more focused on profound intimacy and personal connection. In some of these alternative accounts, Mary Magdalene emerges not merely as a devoted follower, but as one who knew Christ in ways so tender, so deeply human, that they proved profoundly uncomfortable for the prevailing patriarchal structures of the emerging church. Could it be that the very seeds of a sacred bloodline were planted precisely here, in the profound silence, in the cloak of secrecy, and under the oppressive shadow of fear? The earliest church fathers grappled intensely with this unsettling possibility. Some, in a moment of perhaps unwitting recognition, referred to Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles. Others, however, sought to systematically diminish her stature, attempting to reduce her to nothing more than a redeemed sinner. Her profound significance was deliberately eroded, her powerful voice systematically quieted. But what if she was neither a penitent prostitute nor simply a mere disciple? What if, in a twist of fate, she was the chosen vessel of a hidden, sacred inheritance? Imagine, for a moment, The small, clandestine Christian gatherings in vibrant cities like Antioch, ancient Alexandria, or the hallowed streets of Jerusalem. They would gather to pray, to break bread together, and in the hushed corners of their intimate conversations, a profound whisper would travel, that the Son of God may also have been a father, that the kingdom of heaven might have found its earthly reflection in the fragile, vulnerable body of a child. For the nascent church, still in its formative stages, still fiercely struggling for legitimacy and widespread acceptance, such an idea was utterly intolerable. It directly threatened the carefully constructed narrative of a singular, divine Christ, entirely untouched by earthly lineage or any worldly ties. If Christ had indeed left heirs, then the very foundation of authority could pass not through the hierarchical structure of bishops and popes, but through the undeniable inherent power of blood. Thus, the seeds of this profoundly dangerous story were meticulously buried. Yet buried seeds, as nature teaches us, do not truly die. They lie dormant, hidden deep within the earth, patiently awaiting the opportune season to rise again. And as Christianity expanded outward, eventually reaching the heart of Rome, spreading into Gaul, and permeating other distant lands where emperors ruled and theological councils fiercely debated, those persistent whispers did not simply vanish. They traveled quietly, carried meticulously within families, preserved within the sacred walls of monasteries, and cherished in the heart of those who fervently believed that the true story of Christ was far grander, far more human, and infinitely more dangerous than the institutional church would ever allow. The Holy Land served as their fertile soil, but the vast expanse of Europe would ultimately become their sanctuary, and with each passing generation, the seeds of this profound mystery continued to grow, slowly but inexorably. Among all the figures who walked alongside Christ during his earthly ministry, none has ignited more intrigue and mystery than Mary Magdalene. Her name appears repeatedly throughout the canonical Gospels, yet always in tantalizing fragments, almost as if the sacred record itself was reluctant to grant her a full, unvarnished presence. She stands steadfastly at the foot of the cross, a beacon of loyalty when most of the male disciples had fled in fear. She is present at the tomb, the very first to witness the risen Christ, and then, almost as if by deliberate design, she recedes inexplicably into silence. But silence itself, in such profound contexts, can be profoundly telling. For centuries, the Church meticulously recast her image, subtly shifting her role like elusive shadows upon a wall. To some, she was portrayed as a penitent sinner, profoundly redeemed. To others, she was merely a devoted follower, albeit one of great faith. Yet, in suppressed texts such as the Gospel of Mary, her voice rises with a startling authority, teaching, debating, and even daring to correct the male apostles. It is a voice undeniably strong enough to profoundly unsettle centuries of established tradition. But what if her importance was greater still, far beyond even these revelations? Some persistent whispers claim that she was not only a disciple, but also a partner, a cherished companion, a trusted confidant, and perhaps even a wife. In the enigmatic Gospel of Philip, she is explicitly described as the one Christ loved more than the others, a companion frequently kissed. While the language remains artfully ambiguous, the potent suggestion undeniably lingers. Their bond may have been as deeply human and intimate as it was profoundly spiritual. Should this assertion prove accurate, the ramifications would indeed be profound. For through her, a lineage might have been initiated, a sacred ancestry established. Through her, the divine essence could have taken root not merely in abstract teachings and reverent supplications, but in tangible descendants. Consider, then, the trajectory of her narrative following the crucifixion. Venerable accounts recount her flight from the Holy Land, suggesting a perilous voyage across the Mediterranean Sea, culminating in her arrival upon the sun-drenched shores of Gaul, accompanied by a small cohort of devoted adherents. In the southern regions of France, ancient customs and local lore continue to speak of her enduring presence, manifesting in revered shrines dedicated to the Magdalene, hallowed chapels where her name was fervently invoked, and sacred relics purportedly belonging to her. One might ponder why such profound veneration blossomed in this distant land, so far removed from the sacred city of Jerusalem. Could it be that she bore more than just cherished memories? Could it be that she carried within her the very essence of a sacred bloodline? The nascent church, quite naturally, exerted considerable effort to meticulously sculpt and control her public perception. To diminish her standing was to effectively nullify any potential claims of an inherited succession. If she were merely a repentant sinner, her role as the progenitor of heirs would be rendered impossible. If she functioned solely as a devoted follower, she could never pose a challenge to the preeminence of figures like Peter or Paul, nor to the unbroken papal succession that subsequently emerged. And yet, despite the painstaking efforts to reframe her story, her indelible shadow persisted. In the realm of sacred art, she is frequently depicted with striking red hair, a potent symbol often associated with fervent passion, enigmatic secrecy, and the sorrow of exile. Within the grand edifices of cathedrals, her presence subtly lingers on the periphery, never occupying the central space, yet never entirely expunged. In hushed, clandestine traditions, she is remembered as possessing a significance far surpassing the limited role the institutional church permitted. Could it be, one might speculate, that the church harbored a deep-seated apprehension of her? That beneath the enforced silence surrounding her lay the most unspeakable and forbidden truth of all, that she had borne Christ's child, and that their descendants had quietly traversed the corridors of history, their existence systematically denied, yet never fully extinguished from the annals of memory. Mary Magdalene's enigmatic shadow extends its reach across the vast expanse of centuries, and within that enduring penumbra, a pivotal question patiently awaits its answer. Not merely whether she held importance, but whether her importance was, perhaps, too great for the established narrative. In the epochs following the crucifixion, the nascent and fragile spiritual movement that originated in the humble, dust-laden villages of Galilee burgeoned into something far more expansive, far more formidable. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, gradually transformed into the very pulsating heart of a burgeoning empire. And hand in hand with this profound transformation came a new, pressing imperative, not simply to evangelize, but to exert unwavering control. Rome stood as the undisputed epicenter of this monumental shift. By the pivotal era when Emperor Constantine formally embraced the Christian cross, the faith had undergone a dramatic metamorphosis, evolving from a religion of clandestine assemblies into one characterized by magnificent basilicas and powerful bishops. The intimate days of whispered prayers uttered in shadowed domestic spaces were supplanted by the resonant chants of choirs echoing through grand marble halls. What had initially commenced as a humble narrative of fishermen, shepherds, and wandering apostles was now firmly established as an imposing institution governed by emperors and priests. However, with this exponential growth came an inherent peril. Dissenting voices still resonated, albeit faintly. These were voices that recalled divergent accounts of Christ's life and teachings, voices that spoke of gospels deliberately excluded from the official canon, voices that murmured of a sacred bloodline that the burgeoning church could never possibly countenance. One can readily imagine the profound dilemma this presented. If Christ had indeed left behind heirs, then the See of Rome could no longer lay exclusive claim to divine authority. The very essence of sacred power would not reside in revered relics or in the solemnity of the papal throne, but rather in the sanctity of blood itself, in living families whose ancient lineage could potentially challenge the legitimacy of any bishop, any emperor, or any pope. And thus, as the intricate structure of the church began to solidify, so too did its deliberate policy of silence. Ecclesiastical councils were convened with a dual purpose, not only to unequivocally declare what constituted truth, but also to systematically inter other inconvenient truths. At pivotal gatherings such as Nicaea, at Chalcedon, and in innumerable lesser assemblies, bishops meticulously deliberated and cast their votes on which texts would be preserved as sacred scripture and which would be definitively cast out as dangerous heresy. The Gospels ultimately chosen for inclusion in the canon depicted a Christ devoid of heirs, a Christ whose divine mission reached its culmination at the very moment of his crucifixion. The Gospels that were rejected, conversely, often hinted at a figure far more human, far less amenable to institutional control. The Church was compelled to proceed with extreme caution. To concede even the remote possibility of a Christological bloodline was to invite utter political and theological chaos. Dynasties across the empire could then assert a divine right to rule based on their physical descent. Kings could trace their authority not to the blessing of the papacy, but directly to the sacred origins of Galilee. The delicate and intricate web of power that the Vatican was painstakingly weaving would inevitably unravel. Consequently, official doctrine became rigorously hardened. Christ was unequivocally declared divine, eternal, and utterly untouched by any earthly bonds or familial ties. Mary Magdalene, in turn, was systematically reduced, diminished, and relegated to the role of a mere penitent sinner. Any suggestion of marriage, of children, or of a continuing lineage was immediately branded as dangerous heresy. Yet the very nature of heresy often lends it a tenacious ability to survive. Families residing in the distant regions of Gaul steadfastly preserved and recounted stories that actively resisted Rome's authoritative decrees. Monks dwelling in secluded desert caves meticulously concealed ancient manuscripts that offered alternative narratives. In the clandestine shadows, other versions of Christ's profound legacy quietly endured, their existence subdued, but never entirely broken. Thus, as the Church progressively transformed into the grand, imposing edifice of Christendom, it simultaneously became the deliberate architect of silence. Each council, each official decree, each act of excommunication was not merely an affirmation of established faith, It was, in essence, an act of erasure, and one is compelled to ponder, if there was truly nothing to obliterate, why was the act of erasure pursued with such fervent intensity? By the 4th century, the Christian faith had undeniably expanded its reach across vast empires, yet its numerous adherents often spoke in a cacophony of discordant voices. Some passionately preached a Christ divine from the moment of his birth, while others portrayed him as profoundly human, subsequently made holy. Some fervently clung to gospels that spoke of an intimate relationship with Mary Magdalene, while others embraced narratives that depicted him as distant, otherworldly, and entirely untouched by familial connections. The influential bishops of Rome and Constantinople acutely understood that this profound theological disarray could not possibly endure. A burgeoning empire necessitated a singular truth, a unified creed, one definitive Christ, and so, councils were convened, solemn and weighty gatherings where bishops engaged in fervent debate, argued passionately, and ultimately voted on the very fundamental contours of salvation itself. At the pivotal Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the discerning gaze of Emperor Constantine, doctrine was meticulously hammered into immutable stone. Christ was unequivocally declared, begotten, not made, of one essence with the Father. The sacred concept of the Trinity was formally sealed, but what remained conspicuously unsaid proved just as powerful and significant. No mention whatsoever was made of heirs, nor was there any recognition of gospels that subtly hinted at a sacred bloodline. Those particular texts, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, were systematically set aside, formally branded as heresy, and effectively whispered out of common existence. This rigorous process of suppression and redefinition was meticulously repeated across subsequent centuries, at Chalcedon, at Ephesus, and within the very heart of Rome itself. New creeds gradually took shape, always adhering to the same discernible pattern: define precisely what must be believed and rigorously silence what must never, under any circumstances, be spoken aloud. Christ as the eternal sacrifice, yes. Christ as a husband or a father, unequivocally never. Why such meticulous care? Why such an urgent imperative to obliterate certain narratives? Could it be that beneath the surface of those so-called heretical gospels lay a truth considered too perilous for the institutional church to ever openly acknowledge? That the Son of God had walked among humanity not solely as a divine Savior, but also as a man with a family, whose descendants might still have quietly lived among them. Each council transcended mere theological discourse. It was, in essence, a political maneuver artfully cloaked in the guise of prayer. To deny the existence of a Christological bloodline was to effectively secure the unchallenged authority of the papal throne. To systematically erase competing narratives was to meticulously guard the Church's burgeoning power. For if a Christ child had indeed survived, if a family could undeniably trace their lineage back to the sacred soil of Galilee, then Rome's bishops would possess no exclusive monopoly on divine authority. Thus, the creeds were meticulously formulated not merely as declarations of profound faith, but as potent instruments of silence. To recite the Nicene Creed was to affirm not only a fervent belief in God, but also an implicit acceptance of what the Church had strategically chosen to forget and suppress. And yet, beyond the imposing marble halls and the resounding imperial decrees, hushed whispers persistently lingered. Families, in their private spheres, passed down enigmatic tales. Monks, secluded in desert caves, vigilantly guarded secret manuscripts. Legends of a sacred bloodline tenaciously survived in the shadows, even as the ecclesiastical councils diligently labored to erase them from public consciousness. The officially sanctioned creeds meticulously instructed the faithful what to believe. The pervasive silence, however, conveyed its own compelling narrative, and perhaps silence itself can be the most profoundly revealing creed of all. Not every gospel ultimately earned a place within the sacred pages of the Bible. In fact, a greater number were deliberately concealed than were officially preserved. These texts were pejoratively labeled apocryphal, heretical, and dangerously subversive, left to slowly decompose in forgotten caves, meticulously sealed within ancient jars, or ruthlessly consumed by fires kindled by direct command of the ecclesiastical authorities. Yet, remarkably, some managed to endure, and their ancient words still carry the faint, evocative perfume of a forgotten truth. Consider, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, a remarkable compilation of sayings attributed to Christ, providentially preserved in the arid sands of Nag Hammadi and dramatically rediscovered in 1945. It articulated a profound message of an inner light, of divine knowledge residing inherently within each individual, a vision of Christ less reliant on external church authority and far more intimate, more profoundly personal. For the See of Rome, such a gospel presented a grave peril to its hierarchical structure. Then there is the Gospel of Mary. In its pages, Mary Magdalene is unequivocally not depicted as a weeping sinner, but rather as an authoritative teacher, a profound bearer of esoteric wisdom, a formidable leader whose insightful voice often unsettled the male disciples. She recounts vivid visions and imparts hidden knowledge, and in doing so, she positions herself at the very epicenter of Christ's enduring legacy. Perhaps too central, one might suggest, for the preferences of bishops who sought to elevate Peter, Paul, and the authority of Rome above all others. And subsequently, the Gospel of Philip, with its peculiarly strange and highly suggestive linguistic nuances. It describes Mary Magdalene as Christ's companion, a term imbued with powerful shades of intimacy, possessing linguistic roots that could strongly imply a spousal relationship. It even subtly hints at gestures of profound closeness, gestures that eloquently speak of human love and affection, alongside the more commonly acknowledged divine mission. What if these particular Gospels were not summarily rejected simply because they presented minor theological divergences? What if instead they were rigorously suppressed because they narrated a story that the institutional church could absolutely not permit to circulate? The audacious possibility that Christ had been a man with a devoted partner, that love, marriage, and even the natural culmination of children might have been an integral part of his earthly existence. The official justification proffered by the Church was the imperative of uniformity, one singular Christ, one definitive canon of Scripture, one unassailable truth. However, uniformity frequently serves as a deceptive veil for underlying fear. To acknowledge and embrace variety was to risk the emergence of undeniable contradiction. To admit contradiction was to risk the complete unraveling of the Church's painstakingly constructed authority. Consequently, these Gospels were literally and figuratively buried, some physically hidden in remote desert caves, sealed against the relentless march of centuries, their ancient pages patiently awaiting rediscovery like forgotten time capsules. Others were utterly destroyed, their ashes scattering into the silent void of history. And yet, silence, however profound, cannot entirely erase. Whispers of these suppressed gospels persistently endured in the secluded corners of monastic libraries, in the cherished legends of small, isolated communities, and in faint, veiled references made by those courageous enough to remember. The Church had officially declared them forbidden, yet forbidden stories, ironically, often prove to be the most resilient survivors. One might legitimately inquire why, if there genuinely existed no cause for apprehension, these particular texts were not permitted to endure. What compelling reason precluded their coexistence with the accepted scriptures? What profound menace did the ecclesiastical authority perceive within these narratives, save for the potential revelation of a Messiah whose humanity was perhaps too pronounced, whose earthly connections were too tangible, whose ties to a specific bloodline were too firmly established? Indeed, the significance of the suppressed Gospels resonates not merely through their actual content, but powerfully through their very omission. It is within this deliberate void that a profound silence echoes, pregnant with untold possibilities and unacknowledged truths. Despite the relentless efforts of the institutional church to quash divergent viewpoints, the tenacious nature of human memory often finds ingenious ways to permeate barriers. Even as ecclesiastical councils issued condemnations and zealous inquisitors carried out their fiery purges, fragments of these prescribed traditions managed to secure sanctuary in the most improbable of locales. Among the custodians of this clandestine knowledge were certain monastic brethren, men sequestered within the austere confines of stone monasteries, where the gentle glow of candlelight illuminated ancient vellum pages. Ostensibly, their sacred duty was to meticulously transcribe only the officially sanctioned scriptures, the texts explicitly approved by the Roman authority. Yet, a closer examination of the margins frequently unveils an alternative narrative. Through minuscule annotations, enigmatic symbols, and subtle, deliberate omissions, whispers of alternative gospels and veiled ancestral lines persisted. This was not an overt act of defiance, but rather a sophisticated form of covert resistance, just potent enough to ensure the continued vitality of the memory. Other preservers of this legacy were ordinary families. The delicate thread of oral tradition, as ephemeral as a human breath, served to transmit these closely guarded secrets from one generation to the next. In remote territories, far beyond the pervasive influence of Rome, nestled within the undulating hills of southern France or concealed within the secluded valleys of the Pyrenees, narratives circulated. These tales spoke of Mary Magdalene's arrival by sea, of a child cradled in her arms, and of her descendants who purportedly lived discreetly among the local populace. Such accounts were often dismissed as mere folklore, yet it is a recurring historical phenomenon that legends frequently encapsulate truths deemed too perilous to commit to written form. Furthermore, there existed more structured groups, clandestine fraternities, some emerging during the medieval period, others asserting origins of far greater antiquity. These societies adopted distinctive symbols and rituals that appeared to subtly allude to a concealed patrimony. Images of bees, lilies, and stars, meticulously carved into stone or woven into tapestries, became recurring motifs across the centuries. Their meanings were deeply stratified, their ultimate genesis tantalizingly elusive. One is compelled to ponder, was this mere happenstance, or was it a deliberate act of transmuting profound memory into enduring symbolism? Consider the plight of the Cathars of Languedoc, a distinct religious community that suffered systematic persecution to the point of complete annihilation in the 13th century. Their theological doctrines diverged starkly from those espoused by Rome, and among the grave accusations leveled against them was the possession of a secret gospel. This document was reputedly imbued with knowledge considered far too subversive for the Vatican to countenance. Could this hidden text have alluded to a sacred bloodline? Might their brutal extermination have been motivated not solely by concerns of heresy, but by an imperative to silence a dangerous and persistent memory? Time and again, a discernible pattern emerges throughout history. The officially endorsed narrative proclaims a singular, accepted truth, while beneath its surface, another current flows, partially concealed, partially forgotten, yet remarkably tenacious. It is almost as if the very fabric of history steadfastly refused to relinquish the profound notion that Christ's profound legacy might encompass not only the spiritual realm, but also a tangible flesh and blood dimension. Thus, this enduring memory survived, not through overt challenge, but by dwelling in the shadows, manifesting in the intricate carvings adorning cloister walls, in the vibrant stained glass of obscure chapels, and in the hushed, whispered traditions that drifted through the centuries with the elusive quality of smoke. The true custodians of this memory were not formidable armies or powerful institutions. They were humble scribes, unassuming peasants, and dedicated secret keepers, individuals who consciously chose the path of silence over betrayal and discretion over outright extinction. And if the collective memory they so diligently preserved were merely a fabrication, why then did the Church pursue it with such relentless ferocity? Perhaps these steadfast guardians were not, in fact, safeguarding a mere fantasy. Perhaps they were meticulously tending to the faint, yet forbidden heartbeat of a lineage that the Vatican could, under no circumstances, permit to emerge into the full light of day. Should whispers of a potential Christic lineage genuinely have endured through the ages, where might one discern its elusive imprint? Numerous researchers and theorists frequently direct attention towards the Merovingians, the distinctive long-haired monarchs who governed early medieval France, whose esteemed dynasty reigned from the 5th to the 8th century. Their historical narrative is an intricate tapestry woven with threads of profound glory, pervasive mystery, and an abrupt, almost inexplicable disappearance. The Merovingian kings stood in stark contrast to other contemporary rulers of their era. They comported themselves not merely as temporal sovereigns, but as divinely appointed, sacred entities. They famously abstained from cutting their hair, adhering to the deeply held conviction that their flowing locks served as a potent conduit for spiritual power. They laid claim to prophetic visions, miraculous gifts of healing, and an inherent divine right to rule that appeared to emanate not from papal endorsement, but from a source far more ancient, more deeply ingrained, more intrinsically connected to the land itself. Their chosen symbols were notably enigmatic: bees intricately carved into stone, lilies elegantly embroidered onto their royal banners, and stars meticulously etched into their official seals. For some observers, these were simply conventional emblems of sovereign authority, Yet for others, they represented profound signs, resonant echoes of an older, hidden inheritance, a bloodline whose origins extended far beyond the confines of Rome, indeed, beyond Israel, reaching back, perhaps, to the very shores of Galilee. Initially, the Church extended a degree of tolerance towards them. After all, the Merovingians had embraced Christianity, and their influential presence significantly aided in the propagation of the faith throughout Gaul. Nevertheless, their pronounced independence proved deeply disquieting to ecclesiastical authorities. They consistently refused to completely submit to Rome, nor did they rely upon papal sanction as the sole foundation for their legitimacy. They asserted their kingship by birthright, and the perceived weight of their ancestral blood was substantial enough to cause considerable unease among the powerful bishops. Then came the fateful demise of Dagobert II, the final true sovereign of his illustrious line. In the year 679, he met his end through assassination. Historical accounts vary regarding the precise method. Some chronicles suggest he was struck down by a spear, while others indicate a knife. However, what remains unequivocally clear is that his death was sudden, shrouded in suspicion, and remarkably opportune. It proved particularly advantageous for the ascendant Carolingians, an ambitious family who swiftly supplanted the Merovingians, securing their position with the explicit blessing of the papacy. It was equally convenient for Rome, which was thereby relieved of the persistent challenge posed by monarchs who insisted upon deriving their authority from a source entirely independent of the Church. Even more perplexing was the aftermath. The Merovingian lineage was not merely ousted from power, it was systematically expunged from historical record. Chronicles abruptly ceased their narratives. Tombs mysteriously vanished. Names that once held prominence faded into profound obscurity. Dagobert's legitimate son, the rightful heir to the throne, simply disappeared from history, as if his existence had been entirely obliterated. Why such an exhaustive eradication? If the Merovingians were simply an obsolete ruling house, why not permit their memory to persist? What imperative drove such a complete effacement? Unless, of course, there was an inherent quality within their very bloodline that necessitated absolute silence. Legends subtly insinuate that the Merovingians asserted direct descent not solely from ancient kings, but from Christ himself, a lineage purportedly transmitted through Mary Magdalene, via a child conveyed westward following the crucifixion. While this notion may appear fantastical, the sheer ferocity with which their historical memory was systematically scrubbed clean strongly suggests that something far more profound than mere political maneuvering was at stake. The enigmatic Merovingian puzzle continues to cast a long, lingering shadow over the annals of European history. It represents a dynasty deemed too mystical, too fiercely independent, and perhaps, ultimately, too sacred to be permitted to flourish indefinitely. And if their royal blood did indeed carry the prescribed legacy of Christ, then their downfall was not merely a calculated political coup. It was rather a pivotal engagement in the Church's clandestine campaign against a lineage it could never countenance surviving openly. The year was 679, and the ancient forests of Lorraine lay enveloped in a thick, chilling winter mist. It was in this very region, poised between the vestiges of empire and the whispers of legend, that the last authentic Merovingian monarch, Dagobert II, encountered his inexorable destiny. His narrative unfolds not as the tranquil passing of a sovereign, but rather as the deliberate and decisive silencing of a powerful ancestral line. Dagobert was by no means an ordinary sovereign. In stark contrast to the numerous puppet kings often manipulated by powerful advisors and influential bishops, he wielded a palpable authority, maintaining an unyielding independence. Having endured exile as a child, discreetly sequestered within an Irish monastery, he later returned to reclaim his rightful throne. His reign, though tragically brief, was characterized by an unwavering defiance, punctuated by persistent whispers that his lineage embodied something far exceeding mere royal legitimacy, something profoundly ancient, perhaps even intrinsically sacred. And then arrived the fateful day of his demise. Some historical accounts assert he was fatally wounded by a spear during a hunting expedition. Other narratives contend it was a meticulously orchestrated ambush, a calculated assassination artfully disguised as a fortuitous accident. What remains indisputable, however, is that the killing was swift, utterly decisive, and remarkably advantageous from a political standpoint. One must consider who stood to benefit most from such an abrupt removal. The Carolingians, an ambitious and rapidly ascending family of palace mayors, were poised to seize power. They had assiduously cultivated favor with the papacy, pledging unwavering loyalty to Rome in exchange for official recognition. With Dagobert's elimination, their path to supreme authority was unequivocally cleared. In due course, Pepin the Short would be ceremonially crowned with the crucial papal blessing, thereby inaugurating a new dynasty that irrevocably tethered the institution of kingship to the Vatican's explicit approval. Yet, Dagobert had left behind a legitimate heir, Sigisbert IV. And it is at this juncture that the historical trail becomes deeply perplexing. Sigisbert, by all rights, should have inherited his father's throne. Instead, he simply vanishes from all recorded history. His name is barely mentioned, his life utterly unchronicled, his very memory systematically erased. For many, this inexplicable disappearance constitutes the most compelling clue of all. For what conceivable reason would one go to such lengths to erase a child, unless that child's very existence posed an existential threat? Legends claim that Sigisbert was clandestinely spirited away to the south of France, specifically to the region of Languedoc, where his descendants purportedly lived discreetly under assumed identities. If these tales hold any truth, then the Merovingian bloodline did not, in fact, perish with Dagobert. Instead, it receded into the shadows, meticulously preserved in absolute secrecy, hidden from the vigilant gaze of the Church that had so ruthlessly conspired to extinguish it. This act of historical erasure is profoundly revealing. Political adversaries are typically vanquished and often remembered, not utterly forgotten. Yet, in the case of Dagobert and his son, we observe a deliberate and concerted act of silence, almost as if the chroniclers themselves had received explicit instructions to avert their gaze. It is as though the Vatican's covert campaign against a perceived Christic bloodline had, once again, achieved a decisive victory. However, victories founded upon deliberate silence are inherently incomplete. In the forgotten hamlets of southern France, ancient stories steadfastly endured. Narratives persisted of a royal child miraculously rescued, of a sacred lineage subtly intermingling with the common people of the land. These were tales that might have been casually dismissed as mere folklore, yet they harbored within their very essence the unsettling and persistent possibility of a profound truth. Thus, Dagobert's death was far more than the mere downfall of a monarch. It represented the brutal severance of a branch from an ancient tree whose roots, perhaps, stretched back through time to the very soil of Calvary. And while that vital branch was driven into concealment, the fundamental tree itself was never entirely eradicated. History, much like the intricate tapestry of human memory, can never be considered an impartial record. It is perpetually shaped, meticulously crafted, and deliberately edited by those who possess the authority to document its course. When one delves into the ancient chronicles of the early medieval era, a profound absence resonates more powerfully than any spoken word. The astonishing and abrupt disappearance of the Merovingian dynasty. For a span of 2 centuries, these distinctive long-haired monarchs had held sway over the region of Gaul. Their royal appellations were indelibly stamped onto coinage, their decrees formally inscribed into legal charters, and their very presence seamlessly interwoven into the societal fabric of the land. Yet, following the demise of Dagobert, the historical narrative inexplicably falters. The esteemed royal lineage, which once asserted a divine claim to authority, recedes into an astonishingly swift state of obscurity. The annals penned by the ascending Carolingians offer scant information, providing only fragmented accounts, dismissive critiques of perceived Merovingian enfeeblement, and anecdotal tales designed to diminish their predecessor's reign. Dagobert's direct heir, Sigisbert IV, vanishes almost entirely from the historical tableau. Convention dictates that he should have been explicitly referenced, officially recorded, and perhaps even formally invested with the crown. Instead, his existence dissolves into an unsettling void of silence, as if his very being represented a peril too formidable to acknowledge. What could possibly account for such a thorough expunging? Typically, vanquished dynasties are at least accorded a place in memory, if only to serve as cautionary examples. However, the Merovingians were not merely overcome. They were systematically obliterated. Their sepulchres fell into disrepair, their royal bloodline deliberately overlooked. Even their emblematic symbols, the industrious bees, the graceful lilies, the celestial stars, faded from official usage, persisting only as scattered fragments within popular folklore and on half-forgotten architectural stonework. Some historical scholars propose that this extensive erasure stemmed from mere political expediency. The Carolingians, in their quest for legitimate authority, purportedly sought to downplay the significance of their forerunners. Nevertheless, the sheer completeness of this historical void suggests something far more profound than simple convenience. It hints at a calculated intention. If the Merovingians genuinely carried the whispered lineage of Christ, purportedly through Mary Magdalene and her supposed descendants, then their continued existence would have fundamentally challenged the very foundations of papal authority. One might contemplate the profound implications of living heirs, whose very blood carried a sacred, divine claim. Imagine rival monarchs who could assert their right to rule not through the sanction of papal blessing, but through an inherent, hallowed lineage. Such a potent possibility could not be countenanced. Consequently, silence became the Vatican's most formidable instrument. Records were meticulously purged. Historical narratives were painstakingly reconfigured. Where once a venerable dynasty stood, there was now only a profound and deliberate void. Yet, This very absence narrates a compelling story in itself. We discern it within the lacunae, in the abrupt, unpopulated spaces where names and events ought to have been recorded. We perceive it in the hushed tones of chronicles that meticulously detail everything, save for what truly mattered most. We sense it in the enduring resilience of legends that persisted despite vehement official repudiation. Legends of concealed children, of meticulously preserved bloodlines, of profound truths interred more deeply than any physical tomb. This silence, therefore, is far from empty. It is weighty, purposefully engineered, and reverberates with the considerable impact of that which was systematically removed. And as every seasoned historian intuitively understands, silence frequently marks the true genesis of a compelling narrative. With the Merovingians effectively expunged, the geopolitical landscape of Europe underwent a significant transformation. The resultant power vacuum did not remain unfilled for long. Into this orchestrated silence stepped the Carolingians, a burgeoning dynasty whose profound alliance with the Vatican would irrevocably alter the trajectory of Christendom. The Carolingians were not imbued with the aura of sacred legend. They were, in essence, pragmatic individuals, adept administrators of royal estates, and wielders of tangible influence rather than mystical mystique. Figures such as Pippin of Herstal, Charles Martel, and Pippin the Short exemplified strategic acumen and raw power. Their strength, however, derived not from an ancient bloodline, but from astute political alliances. They strategically bound themselves to Rome, and in reciprocal fashion, Rome bestowed its blessing upon their ascendants. The beleaguered papacy, confronted by a multitude of adversaries, desperately required staunch defenders. The Lombards exerted relentless pressure from within Italy. Pagan tribes loomed menacingly on the frontiers, and rival emperors vied for dominance over the very heart of Europe. In such tumultuous times, a dynasty unequivocally loyal to Rome held far greater value than one merely tethered to ancient, perhaps inconvenient, legends. Thus, when Pepin the Short orchestrated the deposition of the final Merovingian puppet king, the Pope himself formally sanctioned the audacious act. A momentous event soon transpired. In the year 754, Pope Stephen II personally anointed Pepin in a solemn and sacred ceremony. This marked the unprecedented occasion of a pope crowning a king, thereby establishing a pivotal precedent that would reverberate through subsequent centuries. No longer would royal legitimacy emanate solely from ancestral blood. It would now undeniably flow from the blessing of the papacy. The Vatican had thus ensured that its guiding hand would forever steer the trajectory of the crown. But why was this assertion of authority deemed so critically important? Perhaps it was precisely because the spectral memory of the Merovingians continued to linger. If whispers of their alleged sacred descent persisted, then the Church urgently required a dynasty it could meticulously control, one whose power was inextricably linked to and inseparable from papal approbation. The Carolingians proved to be perfectly suited for this pivotal role. Their authority was not inherited from some ancient mystical legend, but was explicitly conferred by Rome itself. This profound shift transcended mere politics. It was deeply symbolic. Through the anointing of Pepin, the Vatican unequivocally declared to the world, "It is we who determine kingship. It is we who grant divine authority." Ancient bloodlines, however enigmatic, were now rendered secondary. The true seat of power, the ultimate throne, resided with Rome. And yet, beneath the imposing grandeur of coronations and the solemn pomp of ecclesiastical councils, an intriguing question inevitably arises. Was the Vatican's pronounced eagerness to elevate the Carolingians also a veiled desire to more thoroughly inter the Merovingians, to ensure that no lingering memory of Christ's supposed heirs could ever challenge the burgeoning new order? For if the Merovingians genuinely bore that forbidden legacy, then their replacement was not simply a political maneuver. It constituted a deliberate act of historical erasure, a final decisive attempt to sever the thread of a bloodline that might have fundamentally reshaped the very essence of the Church forever. The Carolingians ascended. Rome's influence grew immeasurably stronger, and the memory of the sacred kings of France gradually receded into the realm of legend. But legends, as the annals of history consistently demonstrate, are remarkably tenacious entities. Even as the Merovingians faded from official chronicles and the Carolingians basked in the warmth of papal favor, subtle traces of the forbidden narrative persisted in places where ink could not reach. Not on fragile parchment, nor within the decrees of councils, but indelibly etched in enduring stone. Within the hallowed abbeys of Burgundy, amidst the soaring cathedrals of the Languedoc, and tucked away in unassuming chapels nestled within the majestic folds of the Pyrenees, peculiar symbols frequently emerge. Bees are clustered around intricately carved arches, lilies are artfully woven into architectural capitals, and stars are meticulously etched into cloister walls where no medieval astronomer would have had any practical reason to chart the heavens. These symbols recur repeatedly, as if deliberately placed, quietly intended for those who possess the discernment to interpret them. The bee was far from an arbitrary emblem. For the Merovingians, it held profound significance as a sacred sign, symbolizing renewal and eternal life. When their dynasty was systematically obliterated, the bee, by all logical extension, should have vanished alongside them. Yet it endured, subtly concealed in carvings, intricately embroidered into ecclesiastical vestments, and appearing in locations far removed from any official heraldry. Did masons and monks consciously preserve it as a form of memory, a quiet act of resistance, a whispered acknowledgement of a lineage Rome desperately wished to consign to oblivion? The lily, too, blossoms with an air of deep mystery. While it would later be famously recognized as the fleur de lis, the quintessential symbol of French royalty, its origins are considerably more ancient, intrinsically linked to concepts of fertility, purity, and a hidden sacred descent. In chapels reputedly founded by Mary Magdalene herself, the lily reappears with striking regularity, almost as if it were gently reminding the faithful that an alternative narrative, a different ancestral root, lies concealed beneath the Church's sanctioned historical account. And then there are the stars, intricate patterns carved into ceilings, constellations mapped with a precision that no medieval artisan could have achieved with mere rudimentary observation. Some distinctly form the familiar shape of Orion, others depict the radiant morning star. Was this celestial alignment merely decorative, or did it subtly allude to deeper, more ancient mysteries, to bloodlines traced not simply through the passage of time, but through the very fabric of the heavens themselves? Beneath the enduring stone, a profound silence resides. Yet this very silence possesses the capacity to communicate. The precise placement of these symbols strongly suggests a deliberate intent. They are never centrally positioned, never overtly proclaimed. Instead, They are marginal, subtly hidden in corners, etched where only the most observant would ever discover them. They function not as grand proclamations, but as hushed whispers. Perhaps the skilled masons who meticulously carved them were privy to stories quietly disseminated among cloistered monks. Perhaps the local villagers who worshipped beneath these symbols recounted tales of Mary Magdalene's arrival in France with a child. Perhaps these symbols were not random at all, but rather intentional acts of remembrance, subtle rebellions against the Vatican's comprehensive acts of erasure. For while papal decrees may relentlessly burn manuscripts and effectively silence dissenting councils, they cannot so readily obliterate solid stone. And so, the whispers persisted, not through written words, but through enduring symbols, largely forgotten by the majority, yet patiently awaiting eyes willing to truly perceive them. And when we do discern them, a profound question ascends like fragrant incense. Were these merely decorative embellishments, or deliberate messages spanning centuries? Were they simply art, or powerful testimony? In the quiet, forgotten arches of ancient chapels, the very stones themselves seem to murmur, "The story is not gone. It is merely hidden." By the zenith of the Middle Ages, the Vatican had evolved into something far grander than a mere religious institution. It had transformed into an empire of the spirit, its formidable influence extending across numerous kings and kingdoms. However, empires are not sustained by faith alone. They are meticulously constructed and maintained through rigorous control. And Rome, in its relentless pursuit of dominion, perfected the intricate machinery of control with chilling precision. At the very core of this formidable machinery resided the Inquisition. Inaugurated in the 12th century, it initially emerged as a potent instrument designed to extirpate heresy. Yet what constituted heresy was not always a simple disbelief in Christ. More frequently, it encompassed adherence to a wrong Christ, a Christ perceived as too human, too intimately connected to Mary Magdalene, too profoundly linked to the unsettling possibility of a direct lineage. Inquisitors received specialized training not only in theological doctrine, but also in the subtle yet brutal art of interrogation. Their questions were honed into instruments sharper than any sword, meticulously crafted to extract confessions from the most stubborn silence. Those accused of possessing forbidden texts or daring to whisper dangerous legends were summarily dragged into torchlit courts, where they were judged not by a jury of their peers, but by the relentless machinery of Rome itself. And if they steadfastly refused to confess, the inferno of the pyre would ultimately achieve what silence could not. An escalating wave of ecclesiastical edicts and pontifical pronouncements began to proliferate, each one progressively constricting the bounds of accepted religious doctrine. Whole communities found themselves condemned for their adherence to esoteric beliefs. A prominent example was the Cathars, inhabitants of southern France, who were unequivocally denounced as heretics and subsequently eradicated during the brutal military campaigns of the Albigensian Crusade. Officially, their condemnation stemmed from accusations of dualist theology. However, veiled within these formal charges were subtle allusions to a legendary Book of Love, a purportedly lost gospel believed to enshrine truths deemed too perilous for the Roman Church to countenance. These truths, it was whispered, might even be intrinsically connected to a direct lineage of Christ. One might well ponder the rationale behind such extreme ferocity, What compelled the systematic incineration of villages, the wholesale slaughter of thousands, and the deliberate obliteration of entire cultural identities? If the prevailing legends were indeed mere fantastical constructs, if the notion of a sacred bloodline amounted to nothing more than unsubstantiated rumor, then why would such an immense expenditure of power and resources be deemed necessary to suppress it? The compelling answer, it is posited, resides in profound apprehension. For an institution whose very foundation rested upon the singular and unparalleled divinity of Christ, the mere concept of potential heirs represented an existential threat, a venomous doctrine. Should a descendant of Christ have indeed survived, then the locus of divine authority might conceivably shift, no longer residing within the venerable walls of the Vatican, but rather within living, breathing flesh, quietly traversing the annals of history across the centuries. Such a revelation would not merely challenge Rome's established power, it would utterly shatter its dominion. Consequently, the intricate machinery of the Church continued its relentless operation. Ecumenical councils issued pronouncements, inquisitors pursued their targets with unwavering zeal, and vast archives underwent systematic purging. With each passing generation, new components, fresh gears, more efficient levers, stronger chains, were integrated into this formidable apparatus. The Vatican's mission was not solely the preservation of faith. It was, more fundamentally, a vigorous defense against historical memory itself. And yet, the sheer intensity of its opposition serves as a powerful indicator that something genuinely consequential, something worthy of such extreme erasure, may well have existed. For true power, it is understood, does not squander its formidable energy on mere phantoms. The vast institutional apparatus of the Vatican, thus transformed into a potent weapon, directed not against conventional armies or earthly adversaries, but against the very act of remembrance. It waged a covert war against a lineage it could never officially acknowledge, yet one it also proved incapable of entirely expunging. And in the profound silence that was meticulously engineered in its wake, the haunting questions surrounding this mystery only amplified, growing ever more insistent. History, it must be understood, encompasses not solely that which endures and is meticulously recorded. It is equally defined by that which is irrevocably lost. And when one critically examines the extensive archives of the Church, the ancient monasteries scattered across Europe, and the once teeming libraries brimming with countless parchments and ink-stained folios, a stark truth emerges with unsettling clarity. An incalculable amount of knowledge has simply vanished. Certainly, some of these losses were attributable to natural, unavoidable calamities. Devastating fires frequently swept through ancient abbeys, leaving behind nothing but ash where shelves once groaned under the weight of accumulated wisdom. Pervasive dampness relentlessly rotted delicate vellum. Insidious insects gnawed away at fragile, aged pages. Indeed, the relentless march of time itself ultimately claimed what human efforts, however diligent, could not perpetually preserve. However, a significant proportion of other losses unmistakably bear the indelible imprints of human agency. Actions that were deliberate, meticulously selective, and profoundly purposeful. Time and again, historical records reveal instances of manuscripts explicitly ordered to be destroyed, gospels that had not been sanctioned by official councils, chronicles that presented narratives contradicting the established ecclesiastical line, and writings that dared to speak too audaciously of figures like Mary Magdalene, or more controversially, of potential heirs to Christ. Some of these condemned texts were consigned to public pyres, their flames ascending as a stark, fiery warning to any who might contemplate similar deviations. Others vanished with far less fanfare, quietly removed from official catalogues, leaving behind only elusive whispers and obscure footnotes to attest to their former existence. Consider, for instance, the Vatican's own extensive archives. Buried deep within the venerable heart of Rome lie miles upon miles of shelving, meticulously guarded for many centuries, with access granted only to a select and privileged few. Scholars fortunate enough to have even briefly glimpsed its labyrinthine catalogues speak in hushed tones of unaccounted-for volumes, perplexing gaps in numerical sequences, and titles conspicuously struck through with red ink. One is left to ponder. Were these invaluable texts lost through mere accident, or were they deliberately silenced, their words deemed too perilous to be permitted to endure? Further reflection turns to the enigmatic fate of the Cathar texts. When the formidable fortress of Montségur finally capitulated in 1244, legend recounts that a small, determined band of believers managed to clandestinely convey away a great treasure. Some accounts assert it was a cache of gold, while others suggest a sacred book, perhaps even a manuscript that explicitly linked Christ to a hidden earthly lineage. Whatever its true nature, this treasure never subsequently resurfaced, as though the very earth itself had mercifully enveloped it, safeguarding it from the destructive fires of Rome. And then there are the myriad scattered hints, tantalizing references found in ancient letters to Gospels that are no longer in our possession. There are mentions of deeply rooted traditions that inexplicably vanish after a particular century. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the enigmatic Book of Love, each of these names resonates like a doorway that has been irrevocably bricked up, leaving us to endlessly speculate about the profound truths that once lay concealed behind them. The widespread disappearance of these manuscripts, it must be stressed, does not in itself constitute definitive proof of a surviving bloodline. Rather, it serves as compelling evidence of an underlying institutional fear. Powerful organizations do not engage in the burning of paper unless that paper poses a genuine and formidable threat to their established authority. They do not meticulously erase records unless those records contain something they simply cannot afford to permit to stand unchallenged. And so, we are left with a profound silence where there ought to be illuminating words, an unsettling absence where there should be continuous history, and perplexing gaps where there should be an unbroken chain of continuity. Yet even in the face of such profound loss, the human capacity for memory stubbornly persists. Legends began to coalesce and expand around these missing texts, as if the very act of their deliberate erasure paradoxically caused them to gleam all the more brightly in the collective imagination. That which was physically burned may indeed be irrevocably gone, but that which was whispered and passed down through generations has remarkably endured. And perhaps this very dynamic offers a crucial insight into why those manuscripts ultimately vanished. It was not because they were devoid of meaning, but precisely because they signified far too much. For in the obscure and often neglected corners of history, the profound absence of words can, at times, constitute the most resonant and potent testimony of all. By the advent of the 12th century, the enduring whispers concerning Christ's concealed lineage found a new cadre of formidable protectors, an order of elite warriors bound not merely by an oath to engage in battle, but also by a solemn vow of absolute secrecy. These were formerly known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, an organization recognized throughout history more simply as the Knights Templar. Officially, their declared purpose was to safeguard pilgrims journeying along the treacherous routes to Jerusalem and to act as staunch defenders of the Holy Land itself. However, beneath their iconic white mantles emblazoned with distinctive red crosses, prevailing legends suggest a clandestine additional mission. Some accounts propose that they unearthed priceless relics buried deep beneath the venerable Temple Mount. Other whispers contend, with even greater intrigue, that they discovered manuscripts long hidden in the desert sands. These were treasures not of gleaming gold, but of profound knowledge. One is compelled to inquire, what specific kind of knowledge might these enigmatic discoveries have encompassed? Rumors circulate of ancient scrolls that unveiled a more human aspect of Christ, potential evidence of his marriage, of direct heirs, and of a bloodline that the established church had diligently sought to eradicate from historical memory. If such profoundly significant documents indeed existed, the Knights Templar may have undertaken their solemn guardianship, clandestinely transporting them across the breadth of Europe, meticulously concealing them within their numerous commanderies, stretching from the bustling streets of Paris to the distant shores of Portugal. Initially, the Vatican extended a degree of tolerance to the Templars. They were undeniably useful, possessing vast wealth and formidable power. They erected imposing fortresses, ensured the safety of vital trade routes, and even provided crucial financial backing to various European monarchs. Yet unchecked power inevitably engenders suspicion, and the Templars, growing independence, soon became a source of considerable apprehension. They famously bowed allegiance to no earthly king, only to the Pope himself. And even that singular allegiance, with the passage of time, began to fray and grow increasingly uneasy. By the early 1300s, unsettling rumors of widespread heresy began to swirl ominously around the order. Hushed accounts of strange, forbidden rituals, whispers of secret initiations, scandalous accusations of idol worship, of sacrilegiously spitting upon the cross, and of dark secrets too unspeakable to articulate openly. Officially, these grave charges were cited as the justification for their impending destruction. However, it is entirely plausible that the deeper truth was considerably different. Perhaps the Templars' most egregious crime was not heresy in the conventional sense, but rather their possession of a perilous secret that Rome simply could not permit to ever come to light. On that fateful Friday the 13th, in the year 1307, the relentless machinery of erasure struck once more with devastating precision. Templars across the entirety of France were apprehended at dawn, their immense wealth systematically seized, and their leaders subjected to brutal torture until coerced confessions were extracted. At the fiery stake, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay met his agonizing demise in the flames, yet with an unyielding defiance etched upon his lips. Some accounts claim he defiantly cursed the Pope and the King who had condemned him. Others maintain that he stoically carried his profound secret with him into the inferno. The enduring question remains, what ultimately became of the Templars' purported hidden knowledge? Some proponents of the theory believe it was shrewdly smuggled away prior to the widespread arrests, carried to safety by knights who managed to flee to distant lands such as Scotland Switzerland, and Portugal. In each of these regions, legends of concealed treasures persist, treasures understood not as mere coin, but as invaluable truths. Could it be that the Knights Templar indeed preserved tangible evidence of Christ's direct bloodline? Could their catastrophic downfall have been not merely a calculated political maneuver orchestrated by the French king, but rather an integral component of the Vatican's protracted, silent war against historical memory? We may regrettably never ascertain the definitive answers to these profound questions. Nevertheless, the remarkable persistence of these persistent rumors, enduring for centuries after the Order's brutal destruction, strongly suggests that the Templars carried far more than just their formidable swords. They carried shadows, hushed whispers, and perhaps the scattered fragments of a legacy deemed too profoundly dangerous for the established Church to ever tolerate. And though their powerful order was ultimately shattered, their enigmatic mystery continues to thrive, stretching like an enduring thread through the intricate labyrinth of human history. When one encounters the word Grail, the immediate mental image for most is that of a cup, a sacred chalice purportedly used to collect the precious blood of Christ during his crucifixion. It is envisioned as a hallowed vessel, diligently sought by valiant knights, often concealed within formidable castles, and perpetually glowing with an ethereal luminescence in the realm of legend. Yet beneath this universally recognized image lies an alternative interpretation, one that fundamentally reconfigures the entire narrative surrounding the Grail. What if the Grail was never, in fact, a physical cup at all? What if, instead, it represented a sacred bloodline? This provocative idea does not originate from mere fanciful speculation, but rather from a profound understanding of language itself. In Old French, the phrase sang real directly translates to royal blood. Over the passage of time, this precise phrase subtly blurred and transmuted into Sangreal, which subsequently became known as the Holy Grail. This was a subtle shift of letters, yet a profound alteration of meaning. What commenced as a direct reference to blood, to a distinguished lineage, was gradually reimagined as a tangible object of spiritual quest. This transformation was undeniably subtle, but its ultimate effect was to obscure a profound truth deemed far too dangerous to be openly articulated. Knights embarked upon their quests for the Grail in the captivating tales recounted by troubadours and within the rich tapestries of Arthurian romances that permeated medieval Europe. These narratives shimmer with layers of intricate allegory, the portrayal of a vessel that is hidden, meticulously guarded, and zealously protected, an enduring lineage that is preserved, kept secret, and strictly forbidden. Could it be that, beneath the surface of the heroic sagas of figures like Percival and Galahad, lay profound echoes of a hidden truth? That the Grail was not a mere relic from which to drink, but rather a sacred family to be protected at all costs. The symbolism deepens considerably when one contemplates the figure most frequently associated with the Grail in certain esoteric traditions, Mary Magdalene. In these particular interpretations, she is not merely an observant witness to Christ's life and death, but is considered the Grail itself. She is the living vessel who carried Christ's precious blood, not within a ceremonial cup, but within the sanctity of her own womb. The child of Christ, born in profound secrecy, thus becomes the living embodiment of the Grail, representing a legacy of flesh and blood, rather than one of inert gold or precious metals. The Church, for its part, assiduously promoted the chalice interpretation, a straightforward relic, safely distant and inherently unthreatening, inspiring fervent devotion without ever challenging established doctrine. Yet the alternate reading, that of the Grail as a living bloodline, was immeasurably more perilous. For it carried the profound implication that the sacred legacy of Christ did not culminate with his sacrifice on the cross. Instead, it continued to thrive and endure, living on through direct descendants who might, even to this day, walk surreptitiously among us. It is conceivable that the proliferation of Grail legends during the 12th and 13th centuries, an epoch coinciding with the ascent and eventual downfall of the Knights Templar, was not merely a coincidence. These narratives, rich in allegory and veiled meaning, might have served as ingenious vehicles for articulating profound truths that, for various reasons, could not be uttered forthrightly. Troubadours, those celebrated poets and musicians of the era, along with other literary figures, may have intricately woven clandestine messages within their verses, melodies and tales designed to captivate the general populace, while simultaneously conveying subtle intimations to a select few, those attuned to discerning the deeper resonance within the artistic expression. If one posits that the Grail at its essence represents a sacred lineage, a vital bloodline, then the monumental quest undertaken by medieval knights transcends the pursuit of a mere artifact. Instead, it transforms into a desperate struggle for survival, the safeguarding of a hidden ancestry, a clandestine dynasty. The valiant chevaliers who embarked upon this arduous journey were not, in this interpretation, engaged in the pursuit of a chalice, but rather dedicated to the protection of living heirs. Consequently, the Grail, a motif frequently portrayed as elusive, timeless, and ultimately unattainable, could be nothing less than the ongoing perpetuation of a significant legacy, one that the powerful Vatican institution tirelessly endeavored to expunge from historical memory. Thus, the enduring enigma of the Grail persists, neither definitively discovered nor entirely lost, but rather continually reinterpreted and reimagined across generations. It functions as a narrative nested within a broader tale, a profound secret encapsulated within a potent symbol. Perhaps it is precisely in the profound silence maintained by the ecclesiastical establishment, in its steadfast refusal to acknowledge or elaborate, that the authentic, underlying significance of the Grail shines forth with its most brilliant and compelling clarity. The fundamental essence of power, it becomes clear, is not solely predicated upon the spiritual adherence of faith, but equally, and perhaps more crucially, upon the meticulous regulation of succession. The papacy, with its shrewd understanding of temporal and spiritual authority, grasped this intricate dynamic with a prescience that surpassed that of any earthly monarch. From its very inception, in the earliest centuries of its formation, the Church devoted immense effort to meticulously ensure that divine authority, the very conduit of sacred power, would flow exclusively through a single sanctioned channel, through the hallowed city of Rome, through the venerable office of its popes, and through a meticulously constructed hierarchy that remained inviolate, deliberately unbroken by the messy complications of biological descent. Yet a profound and unsettling question looms. What if this painstakingly constructed chain of authority could be fundamentally challenged, even rivaled? What if, In a scenario deemed unthinkable by the Church, Christ himself had left behind heirs, living descendants whose very biological connection, their sacred blood, posed an inherent and irrefutable challenge to the Vatican's carefully cultivated monopoly on divine truth. This terrifying prospect, a veritable specter of legitimacy, was the profound apprehension that permeated the august corridors of the Lateran Palace and echoed through the solemn councils convened in its grand, marble-clad halls. The existence of a Christ who had fathered children would inevitably give rise to powerful dynasties, families imbued with an inherent, sacred claim to authority. These would be rival thrones, their legitimacy not conferred by the blessing of the Pope, but rather by the unassailable right of lineage itself. Kings, emboldened by such a heritage, might emerge, proudly proclaiming their direct descent from the ancient lands of Galilee. Queens, too, could ascend to power, their right to rule deeply rooted not in the ceremonial act of coronation, but in the undeniable sanctity of their ancestral blood. In such a transformed world, the Church's once unyielding grip on power would inevitably weaken and falter, its vast influence diminished, its authority reduced to the mere performance of ritual rather than the exercise of true, pervasive rule. This, indeed, was the unspoken, yet ever-present terror, the profound fear of an alternative succession. Historical chronicles offer compelling glimpses into the depth of this pervasive anxiety within the Church. How else can one explain the Vatican's consistent practice of anointing monarchs of its own strategic choosing, from figures as pivotal as Pepin the Short to the monumental Charlemagne, thereby inextricably binding these rulers to the indispensable seal of papal approval? Why else would it meticulously work to systematically erase and discredit powerful dynasties, such as the Merovingians, whose inherent legitimacy appeared to originate from a source that lay entirely beyond the jurisdictional reach of Rome? What other motive could explain the deliberate burning of ancient manuscripts that dared to portray Christ in a more human light, as a devoted husband, a loving father, a man with earthly ties? Every such action, when viewed through this lens, strongly suggests a singular, overarching motive to meticulously ensure that no rival bloodline, no alternative claim to sacred authority, could ever successfully emerge and challenge the established order. Consider, for instance, the profoundly symbolic coronation of Charlemagne, which took place on Christmas Day of the year 800 within the majestic confines of the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's. On that momentous occasion, Pope Leo III personally placed a resplendent crown upon the head of the newly acclaimed emperor. This act transcended mere ceremony. It was an unequivocal declaration, a powerful proclamation reverberating across Christendom. It asserted, without ambiguity, that true authority did not stem from the accident of birth or the claims of blood, but flowed directly from the spiritual fount of Rome. In this divinely sanctioned order, no potential heir of Christ, no matter how legitimate their claim might be perceived, could ever hope to rival the supreme authority of the papacy's chosen champion. Yet the very intensity and elaborate nature of this ritual ironically betray its underlying vulnerability. If the Vatican found it necessary to display its power with such overt boldness and theatricality, it was precisely because the disquieting shadow of another unsanctioned succession continuously loomed. This shadow was fueled by the persistent whispers of unacknowledged heirs, of hidden families whose existence was carefully concealed, and of ancient bloodlines that had, against all odds, managed to slip quietly beneath the Church's formidable grasp, evading its meticulous scrutiny and pervasive control. The profound fear of an alternative succession serves to elucidate the sheer ferocity of Rome's deliberate silence on certain matters. For the concept of succession, in its most fundamental sense, represents the very essence of survival, the continuity of power and legacy. To even entertain the mere possibility of Christ's direct lineage was to invite a future fundamentally antithetical to the Church's established order. A future in which the Vatican would no longer hold its exclusive position as the sole gatekeeper of salvation, where the popes would be relegated to being merely one voice among many, and where the true, living heirs of Christ would speak with an inherent authority derived from their very flesh and blood. Consequently, the Church made a conscious and strategic choice to wage a war, a conflict that was silent, relentlessly pursued, and stretched across many centuries. A war fought not with the clang of swords or the clash of armies, but rather with the potent weapons of systemic erasures and authoritative decrees. And yet, persistently hovering behind all these actions, a haunting question flickered like a fragile candle in the profound darkness of history. If, indeed, there was genuinely nothing to fear, why then did the fear of succession manifest with such overwhelming and pervasive intensity? Doctrine, in its foundational role, serves as the intricate scaffolding upon which the entire edifice of the Church is constructed. It bears the immense weight of collective belief, meticulously binding millions of adherents into a singular faith, a unified voice, and a cohesive narrative. But what profound repercussions ensue when a solitary truth, however seemingly small, threatens to fundamentally fracture the entire meticulously built structure. For the Vatican, the mere contemplation of Christ's direct bloodline was far more than a simple inconvenience. It represented an existential catastrophe, a threat of unprecedented magnitude. Official doctrine unequivocally declared Christ to be simultaneously fully divine and fully human, yet crucially without any earthly heirs. His ultimate sacrifice upon the cross was meticulously framed as the singular, supreme offering, an act unrepeatable and unique, serving as the sole gateway to eternal salvation. If, however, he had fathered children, that meticulously constructed singularity would be irrevocably fractured, shattering the very cornerstone of this theological framework. In such a scenario, the path to salvation would no longer rest exclusively upon an individual's faith in the Church's teachings and sacraments. Instead, it might be inextricably linked to flesh and blood, to the living descendants who, by their very existence, embodied both the profound humanity and the divine essence of Christ. One can only begin to imagine the far-reaching implications of such a revelation. The sacred ritual of the Eucharist, with its solemn promise of partaking in Christ's body and blood, would, in this light, be rendered merely symbolic. For his true body, his actual blood, might, in fact, still course through human veins, residing in his living progeny. The Church's revered sacraments would thereby lose their exclusive monopolistic power. Authority in this altered paradigm could then pass through the channels of family and birthright, rather than through the rigid structures of the priesthood and the solemn act of papal ordination. This, then, was the profound and terrifying threat that the incontrovertible existence of Christ's heirs would fundamentally dismantle and unseat centuries of meticulously developed theology. Every sacred creed, every catechism, every solemn declaration of faith would tremble at its very foundations. The Vatican's long-held authority as the sole indispensable mediator between God and humankind would be called into question, its legitimacy irrevocably undermined. Why indeed would one continue to kneel in obeisance to Rome if one could, instead, kneel directly before Christ's own living descendants, tangible embodiments of his divine legacy? Consequently, the Church's doctrine solidified, hardening into an unyielding and uncompromising stance. Ecclesiastical councils authoritatively declared Christ's divinity to be absolute and his humanity to be entirely untethered from any familial bonds. Mary Magdalene, once potentially a revered partner, was systematically diminished, her narrative reshaped to portray her as a mere sinner. Alternative gospels, which offered differing perspectives, were branded as heretical, and their words ruthlessly suppressed, silenced in the dark recesses of caves or consumed by the unforgiving flames of bonfires. Each such decree, each act of suppression, was not merely a defense of established belief, but a desperate existential struggle for the very survival of the institution. And yet silence, in its profound depth, frequently betrays its own hidden secrets. For what compelling reason did the Church feel such an overwhelming compulsion to defend so fiercely against an idea it adamantly insisted never, in fact, existed? Why the brutal violence of the Inquisitions, the fervent zeal of suppression, the endless and systematic rewriting of historical narratives? Some observers might reasonably contend that doctrine exhibits fragility only when it harbors an inherent fear of contradiction. They might argue that the most vehement denials often serve as a carefully constructed facade, concealing the deepest and most profound anxieties. The threat posed to the Church's doctrine was not merely theological in nature. It was, in its essence, existential. To concede the possibility of a bloodline was to unravel the intricate and ancient tapestry that Rome had painstakingly woven across countless centuries, piece by careful piece. To accept the existence of heirs was to reluctantly concede that Christ's profound legacy was not securely confined to the heavens, but was, in a very real and tangible sense, alive and present on earth. And if that legacy was indeed alive and embodied in living descendants, then the Church's sacrosanct role as the exclusive guardian of salvation was fundamentally compromised. It was no longer unique, it was rivaled, and crucially, it was replaceable. It is therefore unsurprising that the Vatican fought with a ferocity suggesting its very existence depended upon the successful erasure of this possibility, for in a profound and very real sense, it truly did. Wars are conventionally quantified by the number of battles fought, by the ceremonial unfurling of banners, and by fields tragically stained with the indelible marks of steel and blood. However, the Church's most significant and enduring war was waged through entirely different means. It was conducted not with the thunderous might of armies, but with the pervasive power of silence, not through overt conquest, but through the subtle yet potent weapon of omission. This was the Quiet War, an insidious campaign spanning centuries of systematic suppression, a calculated strategy of erasure meticulously woven into the very fabric of historical record. Its genesis can be traced to early ecclesiastical councils that meticulously selected which gospels would be permitted to endure and which would be condemned to vanish into the dust of oblivion. It continued relentlessly through the brutal inquisitions that condemned heretics to the pyre for merely whispering forbidden narratives. The war was further perpetuated by papal bulls that authoritatively condemned entire spiritual movements, by archives systematically cleansed of inconvenient manuscripts, and by powerful dynasties deliberately expunged from collective memory. In stark contrast to the clamor of swords and the roar of cannons, this particular war left no visible battlefields. Instead, it left behind profound gaps, empty spaces in ancient chronicles where significant names should have been recorded. It left haunting silences in vast libraries where once treasured books had rested. It left tombs conspicuously unmarked, as if the very dead themselves were denied the dignity of remembrance, their existence erased from the physical world. Consider, for example, the mysterious disappearance of the Merovingian dynasty. They were not merely dethroned through political machinations, but systematically dissolved from the historical record, their very legitimacy questioned and undermined. Reflect upon the brutal annihilation of the Cathars, destroyed not only in body but meticulously erased from memory, their spiritual teachings reduced to ashes and forgotten. Ponder the tragic destruction of the Knights Templar, consumed by fire, their profound secrets swallowed whole by the relentless tide of rumor and the pervasive weight of silence. Each of these acts, distinct in their immediate circumstances, was an integral component of the same overarching campaign, to meticulously ensure that no discernible trace of Christ's direct lineage could ever survive and flourish in the light of public knowledge. And yet, this quiet war, for all its ferocity and systematic application, was never truly complete, never fully victorious. For silence, despite its formidable power, is never, in its absolute essence, truly absolute. Whispers, tenacious and resilient, often endure precisely where loud proclamations ultimately falter and fade. Legends, like elusive spirits, manage to slip through the smallest cracks in collective memory. Symbols, intricately carved into the ancient stones of cloisters and cathedrals, possess a remarkable longevity, outlasting the most authoritative decrees. And sometimes, or perhaps most paradoxically, that which is deliberately erased only begins to shine with a more intense and captivating brilliance in its very absence. The Vatican's quiet war thus unveils a profound paradox. By laboring with such fierce determination to utterly destroy the mere possibility of a bloodline, it inadvertently ensured that the suspicion of its existence would remain perpetually alive. By ruthlessly silencing dissenting voices, it paradoxically caused them to echo with even greater resonance in the vast expanse of human imagination. By systematically erasing inconvenient stories, it inadvertently transformed them into compelling mysteries, patiently waiting to be unearthed and fully understood. Perhaps this constitutes the greatest irony of all. In its zealous endeavor to extinguish the very idea of Christ's heirs, the Church unwittingly guaranteed that the profound question of their existence would never truly perish. For in this unique historical context, silence itself became a compelling form of evidence, and the act of erasure, rather than obliterating, paradoxically evolved into a powerful, enduring testimony. The quiet war, in its protracted and subtle nature, has no definitive victory to declare. It lingers still, an unresolved tension, residing in the depths of locked archives, in the resilience of unbroken legends, and in the persistent allure of mysteries that remain unsolved. And so, the war continues, not fought with the shedding of blood, but fueled by the restless curiosity of those who dare to wonder, those who relentlessly question why such an immense volume of history was meticulously erased, those who instinctively feel that silence in such profound matters is rarely truly empty. For perhaps the ultimate battlefield is not a physical expanse of earth, but the intricate landscape of human memory. And perhaps the greatest war is not one of territorial conquest, but the relentless, insidious struggle against forgetting. Even amidst the destructive inferno of burning manuscripts and the tragic vanishing of ancient dynasties, some subtle traces of the forbidden story managed to endure. These traces persisted not in explicit words, but in the enduring power of symbols. Quiet, yet remarkably persistent and unyielding, they manifested in the solid permanence of stone and the vibrant hues of stained glass, in the lyrical beauty of song and the solemn repetition of ritual, steadfastly carrying memory through countless centuries when overt voices were brutally suppressed and could not speak. Take the humble bee, for instance. To the Merovingian kings, this seemingly insignificant insect transcended its biological form. It was not merely a creature of the earth. Instead, it stood as a profound emblem of perpetual existence, of rising again from the ashes, and of a sacred, divine order deeply rooted in something far more ancient and fundamental than the burgeoning influence of Rome. Following their eventual historical obliteration, the bee, by all logical accounts, should have faded into obscurity alongside them. Yet its presence remarkably lingers still, meticulously carved into the venerable stone of monastic cloisters, intricately embroidered into the rich fabric of priestly vestments, and strikingly resurfacing centuries later within the grand heraldry of royal houses. This persistent recurrence compels a question. Was its appearance merely an aesthetic embellishment, or a clandestine, knowing acknowledgement of a lineage that was never truly extinguished? Consider also the elegant fleur-de-lis, which blossomed across the French landscape as an unmistakable symbol of kingship and sovereign authority. Officially, its interpretation centered on notions of immaculate purity and unwavering devotion to the Virgin Mary. Yet, some discerning observers perceive within it the subtle echo of Mary Magdalene herself, envisioning it as the lily of hidden descent, a sacred emblem purportedly carried westward from the ancient Holy Land. When French monarchs proudly displayed this iconic symbol, were they primarily proclaiming their steadfast loyalty to the ecclesiastical authority of Rome, or were they, perhaps unconsciously, echoing a profound and ancient legacy that Rome had so relentlessly endeavored to erase from collective memory? In the secluded, often overlooked chapels of the Languedoc region, celestial stars appear meticulously arranged in curious, enigmatic patterns. Constellations are intricately carved into vaulted ceilings, and mosaic designs are precisely aligned with the solstices, demonstrating an ancient understanding of cosmic rhythms. To the uninitiated eye, these might simply be dismissed as decorative artistry. However, to those with a deeper, esoteric understanding, they perhaps function as elaborate maps or profound mnemonic devices, serving as potent reminders that the narrative of Christ was inscribed not solely upon the earthly realm, but also within the vast expanse of the heavens, intrinsically tied to a cosmic rhythm that utterly transcended any earthly, particularly papal, control. Even ancient rituals, meticulously preserved through generations, served as conduits for the survival of fragmented truths. The persecuted Cathars, for instance, spoke reverently of a book of love, a sacred text tragically lost to the destructive flames of religious persecution, yet its essence persisted, remembered in hushed, clandestine whispers. Troubadours, the wandering poets and musicians of medieval Europe, wove intricate narratives around the legendary Grail, depicting it not merely as a hallowed, miraculous cup, but as a vessel of profound human significance, carefully hidden and vigilantly guarded. Numerous secret fraternities continued to enact ancient rites, the precise origins of which they themselves may have only partially recalled, demonstrating how sacred symbols were meticulously transmitted from one generation to the next, much like torches illuminating a treacherous path through profound darkness. These significant signs were never loud or ostentatious. They did not proclaim their message with overt declarations. Instead, they endured with quiet resilience, as if their very subtlety offered the only viable protection against the pervasive, watchful scrutiny of the Vatican. Nevertheless, when these disparate elements are collectively gathered and considered, they coalesce into a compelling mosaic. The humble bees, the elegant lilies, the celestial stars, the haunting melodies, and the hushed whispers, each component, though individually small, fragile, and seemingly unremarkable when brought into conjunction, begins to delineate the contours of an enduring narrative, a story that steadfastly refuses to succumb to oblivion. If the lineage of Christ truly reached its definitive conclusion at Calvary, why would so many successive generations have dedicated such profound effort to safeguarding these enigmatic symbols? Why would individuals have knowingly risked severe repercussions to engrave forbidden emblems into solid stone, to intricately weave them into stained glass, or to meticulously encode them within poetic verse? Perhaps the answer lies in the insistent, unyielding demands of collective memory, or perhaps in the inherent impossibility of achieving a truly complete and absolute silence. And so, these powerful symbols did indeed survive, conveying their profound secret not through explicit verbal articulation, but through their very tangible and persistent presence. They remain discernible in our contemporary world, meticulously etched into the walls of forgotten chapels, cleverly concealed within the intricate designs of ancient coats of arms, and subtly glowing with a faint luminescence within the artistry of bygone eras. They stand as silent, persistent sentinels, patiently awaiting deeper recognition and understanding. When one painstakingly sifts through the historical silence, the very presence of doubt transforms into a compelling form of testimony. For if there truly had been nothing substantial to obliterate, why would the ecclesiastical authority have expended centuries of relentless effort in its attempts to erase it? This persistent doubt hovers like an elusive shadow at the periphery of every historical council and official decree. Consider the pivotal Council of Nicaea, where various alternative gospels were decisively cast aside and deemed heretical. Recall the brutal Inquisition, where mere whispers of forbidden narratives were met with swift and fiery punishment. Reflect on the elaborate anointing ceremonies of kings, meticulously staged with immense pomp and pageantry to unequivocally assert that all legitimate authority emanated solely from Rome. Each of these actions, on the surface, presented an unyielding assertion of certainty. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed veneer of absolute conviction, an unsettling flicker of doubt persistently lingered. Established institutions seldom engage in conflicts with mere ephemeral shadows. Rather, Their battles are waged against tangible and perceived threats. Consequently, the more relentless and fervent the fight waged by an institution, the more one is compelled to ponder the true nature of the challenge they so deeply feared. Why, one must ask, was the Gospel of Mary subjected to such destructive incineration unless it contained a voice deemed too potent and subversive to be permitted? Why were the Merovingians so utterly and systematically erased from historical memory, unless their very bloodline carried a claim that could genuinely rival the supremacy of Rome itself? And why were the Knights Templar annihilated with such unparalleled ferocity, unless they possessed something far more significant and dangerous than mere wealth or fortified castles? The Vatican steadfastly insists that Christ left no direct descendants or heirs, and yet the sheer vehemence of its denial has consistently proven to be far more pronounced and emphatic than the initial question itself, a factor many find inherently suspicious. For absolute self-evident truths, by their very nature, require no vigilant guardians. They stand unassailable and unshaken, impervious to fear or challenge. It is, rather, fragile truths or potentially perilous secrets that necessitate such intense and unwavering vigilance and protection. In this profound way, doubt itself transmutes into a form of compelling evidence. Not evidence of absolute certainty, but rather potent evidence of distinct possibility. The very expenditure of immense effort aimed at eradication strongly implies that there was indeed something substantial and significant to eradicate in the first place. Thus, the enforced silence itself eloquently testifies to a hidden truth. Enduring legends only serve to deepen this profound mystery. Tales abound of families residing in southern France who assert their direct lineage from a hidden child of Christ. Secret societies are rumored to vigilantly guard symbols intrinsically linked to Mary Magdalene. Troubadour songs continue to speak of the Grail, not as a sacred chalice, but as a vessel of a sacred bloodline. Are these merely imaginative inventions, or do they represent authentic echoes of a truth that the Church actively labored to enter and conceal? Perhaps the ultimate answer resides not in what is readily known, but rather in what has been deliberately rendered unknowable. History itself has been meticulously shaped by calculated omission. Archives have been painstakingly scrubbed clean of inconvenient names and records. Priceless manuscripts have been consigned to the destructive embrace of ash. This represents the deliberate crafting of a pervasive silence precisely where vibrant memory ought to have flourished. And yet, silence is never truly empty. It resonates with a profound quality, much like a solitary bell struck within a cloister at the dead of night, its lingering echo serving as a poignant reminder of what once existed. The Vatican may have successfully stifled specific voices, but it proved utterly incapable of silencing the persistent, insidious murmur of doubt. And ultimately, doubt itself may emerge as the most compelling witness, affirming that somewhere, hidden beneath centuries of systematic erasure, a forbidden truth once lived and thrived. Although centuries have elapsed since the era of powerful church councils and relentless inquisitions, this profound question has never entirely faded into obscurity. It continues to linger, detectable within dusty archives, woven into the intricate fabric of ancient legends, and reawakened by unexpected discoveries that stir the imagination anew. Even in contemporary times, whispers concerning Christ's bloodline persistently surface, steadfastly refusing to recede into silence. A notable instance occurred in 1891, when a French priest named Béranger Saunière commenced extensive renovations on his modest church, nestled in the secluded village of Rennes-le-Château. What he purportedly unearthed remains deeply shrouded in enigma. Parchments reportedly hidden within hollow pillars, said to contain cryptic genealogies, intricate codes, and perhaps even subtle intimations of a sacred lineage. Whatever profound secret he ultimately uncovered, it undeniably led to a sudden acquisition of considerable wealth, fostered peculiar and enigmatic behavior on his part, and generated an enduring atmosphere of suspicion within the community. To this very day, his unassuming church remains a focal point for ardent seekers who firmly believe it conceals the ultimate secret concerning Christ's direct descendants. During the 20th century, a collection of documents mysteriously emerged within the venerable Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. These papers, collectively known as the Dossier Secrets, boldly asserted that the Merovingian dynasty traced its lineage directly from Christ and Mary Magdalene, and furthermore, that a clandestine society, the Priory of Sion, had meticulously safeguarded this profound truth across countless centuries. While many esteemed scholars promptly dismissed these documents as elaborate forgeries, the fundamental question persists: why were such extraordinary claims put forth in the first place? And why did they subsequently captivate the imaginations of so many individuals, sparking widespread intrigue and speculation? A proliferation of books and speculative theories swiftly followed in the wake of these revelations. Some interpretations reimagined the legendary Grail not as a mere ceremonial cup, but as a direct, sacred bloodline. Others meticulously traced an intricate web of symbols and genealogies across the breadth of Europe, discerning compelling patterns precisely where official historical accounts had left disconcerting voids. This intriguing idea rapidly transcended academic discourse, permeating popular culture and inspiring numerous novels, films, and endless, fervent speculation. For a significant number of adherents, the sheer persistence of this narrative served as a crucial clue in itself, that the profound memory of Christ's potential heirs could not be entirely obliterated, only artfully disguised within the realm of myth and allegory. Even within the Vatican's own formidable vaults, an undercurrent of suspicion continues to linger. The notorious secret archives, comprising thousands of shelves meticulously hidden beneath the ancient city of Rome, remain largely inaccessible to the general public. While select scholars are occasionally granted fleeting glimpses into these hallowed halls, they are never afforded a comprehensive view. Rumors abound, suggesting the existence of locked-away gospels, papal letters that concede far more than official doctrine permits, and other forms of evidence long concealed from the faithful masses. Whether these whispers hold truth or not, the very act of maintaining such profound secrecy undeniably fuels the enduring mystery. Furthermore, there are families, often bearing unassuming names across Europe, who quietly assert their descent from lineages even more ancient than those of established kings. Their genealogies are frequently intricate and obscure, yet some steadfastly maintain that their blood carries a sacred, unbroken thread, an inheritance meticulously passed down since Mary Magdalene purportedly crossed the Mediterranean Sea with a child. Such claims, while inherently impossible to definitively prove, are equally impossible to entirely dismiss. The contemporary world prides itself on its reliance on empirical evidence, scientific rigor, and verifiable facts. Yet, even within this era of reason, the narrative of a hidden lineage endures with remarkable tenacity. Perhaps this is because every act of erasure inevitably leaves behind discernible traces. Perhaps silence itself serves as its own eloquent testimony. Or perhaps, most profoundly, the human heart possesses an innate longing to believe that Christ's profound legacy did not merely conclude on a desolate hill in Jerusalem, but rather continues, hidden, fragile, yet unbroken within the living veins of his descendants. And so, these murmurs persistently resonate, found within ancient parchments and modern papers, fictional novels and cinematic films, and even in churches where pilgrims kneel, not solely for spiritual devotion, but also for the allure of profound mystery. The Vatican's protracted war of suppression may have succeeded in burying the original narrative, but in our own contemporary era, the whispers are undeniably rising once more. Across countless centuries of relentless suppression, through the destructive power of fire and the chilling weight of enforced silence, one singular idea steadfastly refuses to perish. The compelling notion that Christ's very blood continues to flow quietly, almost imperceptibly, through living veins. It is a thread as delicate as spider silk, yet possessing a resilience robust enough to stretch across millennia. Some proponents suggest that this sacred thread passed through the Merovingian kings, eventually slipping into profound obscurity after the line of Dagobert was systematically erased. Others contend that it persisted through lesser-known, more discreet families, concealed beneath new identities and vigilantly guarded by layers of secrecy. This thread, they propose, became intricately woven into the very fabric of Europe's history, entangled with countless dynasties and marital alliances, yet, crucially, it was never truly severed. Enduring legends in southern France vehemently insist that Mary Magdalene transported her child across the vast expanse of the sea, thereby establishing a sacred lineage within the verdant valleys of Provence. The Cathars, prior to their brutal annihilation, were reputedly known to venerate a hidden gospel intimately connected to this profound legacy. The Knights Templar, controversially accused of heresy, may have acted as the unwitting custodians of its irrefutable proof. Each subtle clue, each fragmented piece of this complex puzzle, consistently points not towards extinction, but rather towards an astonishing survival. Ultimately, the enduring symbols persist as tangible markers of this unbroken thread. The humble bees, the elegant lilies, the celestial stars, meticulously carved into ancient stone, intricately embroidered into ceremonial banners, and thoughtfully woven into ritualistic practices. They function not as overt proclamations, but as subtle, persistent reminders, silent yet potent testimonies that a profound, hidden inheritance demonstrably continues to exist. The very endurance of skepticism, a persistent undercurrent of doubt, powerfully suggests an unbroken lineage. For the Vatican's systematic obliterations, its relentless inquisitions, and its steadfast refutations of certain narratives have proven to be seemingly without end. One is compelled to question the intensity of such a protracted struggle if the perceived menace had genuinely dissipated into history. Why would such fierce suppression be continuously exerted if, in reality, there remained nothing of substance to silence? Perhaps this elusive thread of continuity remains intact precisely because it was never destined for severance. It is conceivable that descendants of this lineage still move among the populace, entirely anonymous and largely overlooked, their ancestral names having faded from the annals of conventional history. Yet their very essence, their biological heritage, might carry a profound secret that the authoritative grip of Rome could never truly claim or extinguish. If this indeed holds true, then the most monumental narrative is not inscribed within historical chronicles or meticulously carved into enduring stone monuments. Rather, it is carried within the living human form, resonating in every breath, in every vital heartbeat of those who bear this hidden, sacred legacy. And although the specific identities of these individuals may forever elude our grasp, the sheer tenacity of the legend itself provides ample corroboration. A profound truth, a significant historical reality, does not persist in haunting the collective memory of humanity unless it retains an active, living presence in some form. This continuous, unbroken thread, though largely imperceptible to the casual observer, serves as a powerful, invisible nexus, binding the distant past inextricably to the unfolding present. It stands as a potent reminder that what the Vatican diligently endeavored to expunge may not have been utterly annihilated at all. Instead, it might have been merely meticulously concealed, patiently awaiting discovery by those discerning individuals who possess the willingness and insight to truly perceive it. And if this profound hypothesis proves to be accurate, then the extraordinary narrative of Christ is far from concluded. It continues its unfolding journey still in clandestine channels, within obscured contexts, and in the profound quietude that cloaks its existence. Every narrative, without exception, must ultimately reach its conclusion. And yet, paradoxically, some denouements are not definitive endings in the traditional sense. Instead, they manifest as profound silences, soft in their approach, deliberate in their imposition, and perpetually unfinished in their implication. The compelling tale of Christ's supposed bloodline unequivocally belongs to the realm of such enigmatic silences. The Vatican's protracted campaign, its war against the very fabric of historical recollection, was relentlessly pursued with unwavering determination. Ecclesiastical councils systematically repudiated certain gospels, effectively casting them out of accepted doctrine. Tribunals of the Inquisition ruthlessly silenced dissenting heretics, extinguishing their voices and their influence. Dynasties perceived as threats were summarily dethroned, their power dismantled. Ancient manuscripts, potentially containing inconvenient truths, mysteriously vanished from existence. Esoteric symbols, pregnant with meaning, were meticulously hidden within architectural stone, concealed in plain sight. And yet, despite the sheer magnitude and sustained effort of these formidable endeavors, the fundamental question continues to linger. It is not vanquished, nor is it utterly extinguished. It is merely interred, profoundly hushed, but undeniably present. If there was genuinely nothing of consequence to erase, why then was so much effort dedicated to its erasure? If there was truly nothing to fear, why did centuries of such profound apprehension and defensive action persist? These critical questions, charged with historical weight, rise like fragrant incense in the forgotten chapels of time, filling the air long after the last prayers have faded into oblivion. Perhaps the very absence of sound, the profound quietude itself, constitutes the most compelling testimony, for silence possesses an inherent eloquence, It communicates to us that something of immense significance once stirred, something that demanded immediate and forceful suppression. It conveys the crucial insight that historical memory could not be left to the unpredictable caprices of chance or natural evolution. It had to be rigorously managed, meticulously controlled, and systematically expunged from the collective consciousness. And still, despite all efforts, the whispers of this hidden narrative persistently endure. They echo in the serene villages of southern France, where modest shrines dedicated to Mary Magdalene glow with the soft, unwavering light of countless candles. They resonate within the haunting ruins of Montségur, where ancient legends of a concealed treasure stubbornly refuse to die, clinging fiercely to the windswept stones. They surface in the intriguing tales of the Knights Templar, who may have clandestinely carried forbidden knowledge into their mysterious exile, safeguarding it from hostile forces. And they are subtly etched in the heraldic fleur-de-lis, the industrious bees, and the celestial stars that still distinctly mark the ancient stones of Europe, serving as faint yet defiant signatures of a lingering resistance. The Vatican's extensive war, while perhaps succeeding in muting certain direct voices, demonstrably failed to quell the boundless power of human imagination. And imagination, once ignited and stirred into fervent activity, transforms into its own distinct and compelling kind of truth. For whether the bloodline exists as a literal, biological reality or not, the very undeniable fact that it was so profoundly feared by such a powerful institution is, in itself, sufficient to ensure its continued vitality and presence in the collective consciousness. So tonight, as we bring this intricate journey of historical and speculative inquiry to a close, let the profound silence linger. Let it settle upon us, resting heavy and palpable, much like the immense weight of centuries pressing down upon the present moment. And within that contemplative silence, allow yourself to pose a fundamental question. Did the ecclesiastical institution ultimately succeed in its protracted war against this hidden legacy? Or did it, paradoxically, fail in its ultimate objective? Did it manage to completely bury the bloodline into oblivion? Or did its very actions inadvertently make it stronger by driving it deep into the enduring, indomitable realm of legend? The definitive answer to this complex enigma will assuredly not be discovered within dusty official archives, nor within the hallowed, echoing naves of grand cathedrals, nor in the carefully worded pronouncements of authority. Instead, it will be found only in the quiet, unassuming places, in the faint yet persistent whispers that steadfastly refuse to fade into nothingness, and in the deep, elusive shadows where historical memory continues to breathe and subtly assert its existence. And perhaps, even in this very moment, the descendants of this ancient bloodline walk among us, unknown, unacknowledged, yet undeniably alive. The Church's long, silent war may indeed have succeeded in interring the truth, but the profound silence it created, ironically, still speaks volumes.